Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IGP Soundbite this week. We're continuing our work on modelling natural prosperity for the future, and I'm delighted today to be able to welcome Dr. Beth Nicholls. Dr. Nicholls is a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the University of Sussex, and she uses a combination of behavioural, physiological, and field-based techniques to study the sensory and learning processes that determine the foraging decisions of insect pollinators and the implications for insect nutrition, plant-insect interactions, and the provision of pollination for wildflowers and crops. And a major motivation for her research is to contribute towards solutions for the dual challenges of halting and reversing insect declines, which we all know is so crucial, and sustainably intensifying food production to meet growing demands. Dr. Nicholls has a background in animal behaviour and cognition and obtained her PhD from the University of Exeter. She has held postdoctoral positions at the University of Exeter at Rothamsted Research and visiting researcher positions at Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg in Germany, and the India Institute of Science, Education and Research at Viruvanathapuram, India. And she joined the University of Sussex in 2014 as part of, as a postdoctoral researcher in the lab of Dave Goulson. And she founded her own research group in October 2020 under the UKR Future Leaders Fellowship. So she's passionate about communicating her research to the public and widening participation in science. And she's the lead organizer of something called Soapbox Science Brighton, an annual event which aims to highlight female researchers in STEM fields in the Southeast. So welcome, Beth, to the IGP. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. And I think we should get right into it. I'm just going to hand over you and the floor is yours, please.
Thanks very much, Henrietta. I'll just share my slides. So thanks for that brilliant introduction. And today I'm going to be talking about some of our work on urban agriculture and how we used a citizen science approach to look at the productivity and the role of pollinators in producing food in cities and urban areas. So I hope it's not too controversial a statement to suggest that conventional and current agricultural practices are having kind of fairly catastrophic effects on our environment. So our current approach of sort of intensive, high input farming is leading to severely degraded soils, the contamination of soil and water courses through pesticide and fertilizer use. And conventional agriculture is also a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And collectively, these processes are leading to habitat destruction and also widespread biodiversity loss as well. And I'm sure you've kind of seen these kind of statistics or these kind of infographics, but the irony is that these kind of farming practices are also undermining the biodiversity and ecosystem services that they're dependent upon. So things like nutrient cycling and the provision of pollination services. So around 75% of all food crops grown across the world depend to some degree on insects for pollination. And around 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we consume is sort of owed to pollinators. And I think this is a really nice illustration of the fact that we're not likely to kind of starve without insect pollination. There are plenty of crops that don't rely on insects, but our nutritional choices and kind of our nutritional health will be severely limited if we don't have those insect pollinated crops in our diets. And there's a slight correction needed on all of these kind of images, is in that it's not just bees that are responsible for pollination. So many crops are pollinated by flies, for example, or beetles, and very importantly, coffee and chocolate rely on fly pollination and midges rather than bees. So I always think it's important to make that distinction. There are many different estimates of the kind of value of insect pollination, but probably the most commonly cited is this paper from 2008, which puts the global worth at around 153 billion euros annually, Of course, again, it's fairly controversial to put a price on biodiversity or put an economic valuation, but certainly when working with producers and policymakers, it can be useful to kind of put the value into monetary terms to kind of get your point across about the importance of ecosystem services. So therefore, it's rather worrying that we're seeing massive declines in insect pollination, in insect populations, sorry. We actually don't have terribly good data on insect abundance. There aren't kind of, even in the UK, particularly formal monitoring schemes. But we do have good data on distributions, and we can see that distribution of many pollinating insects has contracted. And this paper from 2017 raised quite a lot of alarm bells because it showed a 75% decline in insect biomass, which is admittedly a rather crude value or crude measure, but it shows a huge decline over the past 25 years or so. And perhaps even more worryingly, this data comes from nature reserves where we would actually expect wildlife and biodiversity to be doing slightly better than perhaps in farmed land or in urban areas. Specifically in the UK, we know that we've lost 23 species of flower visiting bees and wasps in the past 150 years. And I find this paper showing the dramatic declines in specifically farmland butterflies over just a 10-year period, fairly worrying as well. And of course, this has knock-on effects for higher trophic levels and species that we perhaps do have better data on, such as birds, which are reliant on insects as a massive part of their diet. So we're also seeing declines in invertebrate species as well. Now, some people might suggest that in terms of crop production, it's fine. We can just use honeybees. They're a managed pollinator. We can move them, you know, around as and where we need the pollination services. But recent data is increasingly showing how important insect diversity is for pollination. So this figure here shows quite nicely that, you know, if you just have a single species, these yellow bees, say that they're honeybees, you might reach the kind of threshold level of pollination needed to produce your crop. But as you're adding more species diversity, the level of pollination and therefore the yields that you get from your crop are increasing. And for certain crops or certain areas, just having a single species might not be enough. So just having the yellow bees might not be enough to get you to your threshold level. And a really nice study by Lucas Garibaldi also showed that simply having honeybees is not enough to get the kind of maximal levels of fruit set for a whole suite of different crops. And for certain crops, you know, coffee I've mentioned is very important to me at least. Honeybees simply can't pollinate that crop. Tomatoes as well, they need to be pollinated by bumblebees. And so simply relying on one species of insect is not sustainable and doesn't provide kind of an adequate level of pollination. Add to that the fact that our population is growing, we're really facing an immense challenge to produce more food whilst also minimising the environmental damage that food production is causing. Also, many people around the world are moving away from rural areas where food is traditionally grown into cities, with the UN estimating that around 68% of the world's population will live in cities and urban areas by 2050. So that kind of raises the question about whether we should be moving food production closer to where people are now living and adding kind of extra protection to areas of high biodiversity. Another kind of worrying statistic is the fact that many people living in deprived areas in urban areas and cities are living in what's known as a food desert. That means that they have very limited access to fresh fruits and vegetables. They're often forced to kind of shop at local convenience stores that may not have a good range of fresh fruit and veg, or may not have, you know, affordable options for people living in those areas. So again, could moving food production to cities or providing people with space to grow their own food improve nutritional choices for people living in more deprived parts of our cities and urban areas. So if we need to produce more food, ideally we won't clear more land to do that and put more pressure on kind of biodiversity, but also using that land more intensively also can be problematic. It can lead to higher emissions, for example. So we need to perhaps look for alternative or complementary solutions to producing food. And it's actually estimated that urban agriculture may already provide up to a fifth of the world's food, based on this paper by Thebo et al. Actually estimating production in urban agriculture is fairly difficult because of the nature of this type of farming. So particularly in developing countries, urban agriculture tends to be fairly ad hoc. It's not very well monitored, and in some cases food may be grown on land that technically doesn't belong to the people farming it, so there are some issues around legality there as well. And so collecting data on this type of farming is quite difficult, and the data that is available currently is fairly limited. And so as part of the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, I worked with a team of researchers from quite diverse academic backgrounds, with the goal of looking at interactions between the Sustainable Development Goals, which were published by the UN in 2015, and looking at how we can kind of maximise those synergies between the goals and minimise the trade-offs relating to urban food production. So we began with a literature review of what data is available on food production. And again, as I say, looked for kind of those areas where there are linkages between the Sustainable Development Goals that urban agriculture can contribute to, but also looking for potential kind of drawbacks of growing food in our cities as well. And so the main kind of benefit is that there is evidence that providing space for people to grow food in cities does improve their access to fresh food. It can also provide a source of income as well if people are growing surplus. It can contribute to making cities more sustainable, so reducing the distance that food has to travel to reach people's plates. And there are many kind of well-being benefits associated with improving people's access to green space and improving their access to fresh food. It can actually provide some mitigation against climate effects. So it can help, having kind of green space in a city can help to reduce urban heat islands and provides a better flood defence than kind of impervious surfaces. And there's increasing evidence to suggest that urban agriculture can also boost biodiversity and provide a refuge for wildlife. But of course, land in cities is at a premium. There's competition with space for housing, for example. And depending on what the land has been used for before the growing, there is a risk of kind of exposure to contaminants such as heavy metals. And if people are using a lot of pesticides in urban agriculture, then there's the question of where that kind of runoff of those chemicals is going and whether that's putting people's health at risk in cities as well. We then moved on to conduct a case study in the city of Brighton and Hove, where Sussex University is based. And the main aim of this case study was to develop a citizen science methodology to collect data on urban food growing that could then be rolled out to other urban contexts and other cities. And Brighton is a great place to develop this method and to conduct a case study because it's actually the first UK city to have a food strategy, which was developed by the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership in 2006. And if you know Brighton or you're aware of the city, of course, it has this very kind of affluent reputation as being, an extension of London, it's a very nice place to live, but there is a lot of deprivation in the city as well. And it's estimated that around 8% of residents are struggling to meet their basic food needs. And our local NHS trust is spending a lot of money each year tackling food-related diseases. It also has a lot of growing space already. So there's around 50 hectares of land distributed across the city between individual allotment holders and community gardening programs as well. So the aim of the Citizen Science Protocol was to help us to collect data on how productive urban agriculture is, so how much food can it produce? What are the risks from pesticide use? Because this isn't monitored, domestic pesticide use is not, data isn't collected on that in the same way that it is for conventional agriculture. But you know, you can go to a supermarket or a garden centre and buy a whole suite of pretty toxic chemicals to use in your garden, and no one is really kind of checking up on how much you're using and if you're storing it safely. And then we were also interested because myself and one of the other team members are insect ecologists on how dependent urban agriculture is on insect pollination. People haven't really looked at pollination in cities to a large extent, and it's not clear whether there are even enough pollinators in our urban areas to be providing this pollination service. So to kind of collect data on these three questions, we asked people to weigh how much food they were harvesting from their allotment plots. We asked them to keep a diary of any pests that they encountered and what they did to control them, whether they used pesticides or not, and what types. And then we also trained people in measuring insect visitation to the crops in their allotments or gardens as well. And we recruited volunteers in a very traditional way. So we put posters up around the allotment plots. We did a bit of social media as well, but we really didn't want to kind of discriminate against any kind of age group or, you know, people who might not be so engaged online. We also did some press releases. Here's me with my poor PhD student in this giant bee costume that has got a lot of use for kind of publicity from our research over the years. And then we also had some media coverage. So this is one of our volunteers being interviewed by BBC Sussex to raise awareness of the project as well. And so we, over the 2 years of the study, recruited around 130 volunteers. And once recruited, we held and invited the participants to training events across the city, where we explained what the project was about and also taught people how to collect the data that we were after. They were also able to kind of input into how we might improve methods or where things weren't clear. And we also provided a bit of training on how to identify the main insect groups that they might see in their allotment. And all the data was collected in these diaries, which they could then kind of input the data or post them back to us for us to input the data. And the website's still live, so you're welcome to visit it to have a look at the resources, and welcome to use them in your own kind of community growing spaces if that's of relevance. So we got a really good recruitment, as I mentioned, across the city, but actually only about 18% of the volunteers, so about 34 people, submitted data. That's a bit disappointing, but actually fairly typical for citizen science. And one of the major drawbacks is that you often get people really interested in the project, but when it comes to actually kind of committing their time, life gets in the way, and so the level of participation often does drop off. But thanks to the feedback from the growers, we were able to kind of improve engagement over the study. So kind of asking the participants what they liked, what they didn't like about taking part was really key to getting better engagement over time. And we had around 1,200 records submitted in total, which is quite a good amount of data for a fairly restricted geographical area. And so in terms of the data on productivity, we found that on average people were growing in a plot size of around 175 metres squared, which is actually the standard allotment size in Brighton and Hove. And people were harvesting around 70 kilos worth of food on average per season. And it's important to note that that's actually only insect pollinated crops. So that's things like berries and fruit and beans, but doesn't account for non-insect pollinated crops such as root vegetables and potatoes. So our data is a little bit of an underestimation of the productivity, because we were mostly interested in insect pollinated crops. The range was huge. So some people were harvesting up to 250 kilos worth of food per season. And the average yield was around 1 kilo per metre squared, which is similar to some other studies that have been conducted in the north of England. But again, it was super variable, and some participants were harvesting close to 10 kilos per metre squared. So a really impressive level of productivity. You can see here across the kind of broad crop types, the yields are pretty variable, both within and across crops. And making comparisons with conventional farming is actually a little bit difficult in the UK, because a lot of insect pollinated crops, such as soft fruits and tomatoes, for example, tend to be grown under glass or in polytunnels. But the yields for beans are fairly comparable, and compared to non-insect pollinated crops such as wheat and oilseed rape, they're not that far off the levels being gained from conventional farming. But it's pretty hard to compare, to be honest, for the data we have for the UK. We also provided growers with a kind of fun tool that they could use to calculate how much their produce would be worth if they bought it at the supermarket. And it would also calculate for them, depending on how insect dependent that crop was, what amount of that crop value was kind of owed to pollinators. Again, there were some issues around kind of putting a price on that service, but we thought it was quite a nice tool to engage the public with, and to help them understand the value of pollinators to their food production. And you can try it yourself if you want to visit our website. So on average, people were harvesting about £550 worth of food per season. Again, that's just insect pollinated crops. And around £310 worth of that was owed to pollinators on average. But some people were harvesting as much as £2,000 worth of food, which is pretty impressive. And those crops that had the highest pollinator price, so the most kind of valuable, were things like soft fruit, like cherries and raspberries, which tend to be pretty pricey to buy at the supermarket, and also pumpkins as well, because they're highly dependent on insect pollinators. There was pretty good news in terms of pesticide use. So in less than 4% of cases did people use kind of conventional insecticide sprays. The main exception was slug pellets. So a lot of people were using slug pellets, often organic, but they can still kind of do damage to higher trophic levels, such as birds and hedgehogs, for example, that are feeding on the slugs. And it is worth noting that we conducted the study in Brighton, which is a fairly kind of green city, and we were also recruiting people based a little bit around their interest in pollinators. So we may have a slightly biased sample towards kind of pro-environmental behaviour. So it would be interesting to repeat this in kind of other regions and other cities. We may find slightly different results, but really there isn't very much data on kind of quantifying pesticide use. So the results are interesting and promising. We also ran an experiment ourselves, where we wanted to look at assessing whether there were enough pollinators in the city to provide kind of the maximal yields. So we did this by growing strawberry plants and placing them directly into volunteers' allotment plots. And we placed 2 plants side by side. One of the plants just received insect pollination from wild pollinators in the environment. And then one of the plants got a little extra helping hand from us. So we hand pollinated those flowers to ensure they had the maximum chance of producing fruit. So if there are enough pollinators in the city, then we wouldn't expect to see any difference between the yields of these 2 plants. So there's enough insect visits, the fruit yields are kind of maximised. But if there is a deficit of pollinators, then the ones that have had the helping hand from us would be expected to produce better or more fruit. Actually, or a nice result is that we found there weren't any differences in the yields between the 2 crops. So that's reassuring. That suggests that there are enough pollinators to pollinate crops grown in urban areas, in Brighton at least. We did find a slight difference in the kind of qualitative like looks and appearance of the berries. So these are some classifications used by conventional growers, and you wouldn't see kind of class 4 and class 3 strawberries in your typical supermarket punnet. It was a very slight difference, which suggests there's some opportunity to improve pollination in the cities through improving pollinator habitat, for example. But, you know, for home growers, they probably don't care if their strawberries are a little bit knobbly and bobbly. So our conclusions from the case study are really that urban farming can be pretty productive. And at least in the UK or in Brighton, the pesticide risk seems to be fairly low. And insect pollination is important to urban agriculture. It's contributing kind of quite a high value. And at least for strawberries, there seems to be sufficient pollinators to provide that service in Brighton. But a really major drawback, I suppose, of our case study and our approach is that we weren't able to estimate the cost of other inputs into this farming. So if we're going to make comparisons with conventional farming, it's important that we're factoring in the cost of labour and other inputs as well. But around the same time as our study came out, there was this really nice study conducted in Australia by a research group there, where again they looked at the yields of urban kind of allotments or small holdings in Sydney compared to rural farms that are also producing fruit and veg, and found that the yield of the urban farms were about twice that of the commercial ones, which is really impressive, very surprising. But although they were using the land in a pretty efficient way, which probably accounts for the higher yields, the study found that materials and labour usage was pretty inefficient. So on average, the gardens were running at a loss in the city. And factoring in kind of energy use and labour and kind of fertilisers and that kind of thing, actually the energy use of the urban farms was about 1 to 3 times higher than conventional rural farms. But they did a kind of simulation to show that if they could replace some of those non-renewable inputs with local renewables, such as, you know, harvesting rainwater, for example, that it would be possible to kind of reduce the environmental loading ratio quite substantially. That was a really, really nice and complementary study to our results. And of course, urban agriculture is not just about kind of productivity. There are lots of other benefits, as I kind of mentioned earlier on. So there's quite a few studies showing that growing your own food can improve your connection to nature. It enhances community cohesion, and urban growing works particularly well at a community level because you can share the labour, but also share those kind of gluts of courgettes or tomatoes that you get. And improving access to green space is also shown to have mental health benefits. And this study showed that for slightly older allotment holders over the age of 60, for example, a comparison between them and their neighbours living in kind of similar economic areas, they were kind of more healthy and more physically active. So there seems to be some health and well-being benefits that would be interesting to look further into. And a really nice study from Catherine Baldock, who's based at Northumberland University, shows that out of all the kind of habitat types that they looked at in cities, including nature reserves and parks, allotments actually had the highest abundance of bees and other pollinators as well. And this figure really nicely shows that for every kind of additional 10 hectares of these different land uses, the benefits to plant pollinator networks is really pretty high for allotments. It's also quite high for cemeteries, but I'm not sure where we stand on increasing areas of cemeteries in cities. But there are substantial gains for biodiversity, it seems to be had through increasing urban growing space in cities. So just very briefly going forward, we are replicating the study with our collaborators, Professor Parthiv Basu at the University of Calcutta. And their team helped a lot in the development of the citizen science methods as well, because they've done a lot of work with growers on the ground there. And from our kind of preliminary interviews and site visits, there is quite some similarities in the crops and the styles of growing and the labour intensiveness, but the risks from pesticides seem to be substantially higher in Calcutta. So that's something that we would also like to look further into and to do some quantification of that. And I'm also part of the Food Systems Doctoral Training Programme, which UCL is also part of. And so starting next month, we have our first Kernel student, Leah Salm, And she's going to be following up some of this work as well, so looking at the pollinator dependency of other crops in urban areas and repeating some of those experiments as well. So really big thank you everyone for listening and for inviting me to speak, and of course thank you to all the citizen scientists and my collaborators, and I've had quite a few project students over the time who've also helped with collecting the data. So I will stop sharing now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Beth. That's really fascinating work. And we've been doing quite a lot of work on urban agriculture in the IGP from a slightly different point of view, but which I'll come on to in a minute. But I was just wondering, one of the things you didn't talk about was sort of fertilizers and manure. Did you get any data on that? Because presumably allotments are very good at people putting their own manure in, aren't they?
Yeah, we actually didn't quantify that in this study, but I think that would be really important. There's a nice study from Sheffield University where they did look at that. They used quite similar methods to us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I can't remember the results off the top of my head, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's quite important, and I think there's definitely kind of a lot of variability between people's growing styles as to whether they use synthetic or kind of organic fertilizers.
Yes, yeah. Which might account for some of the variability you saw in sort of productivity. I mean, but nevertheless, I mean, what's interesting is, you know, one of the things that we've been pioneering in the IGP is a kind of whole systems approach to transformation. So just as you suggested in your talk, you know, we need to increase the number of pollinators, but we also need to improve soil structure and reduce toxicity, particularly in water systems and so on. So what stage have you got to with the work in India? Because I'm very interested in how that's going.
Yeah, so during the kind of when I was kind of working on the grant, we went out to visit and to conduct some kind of baseline farmer surveys. And now part of students and postdocs are kind of working on, I guess, translating our kind of methodology into local language and kind of then rolling it out there. But we don't have any kind of data collected yet on kind of productivity from those farms.
Yeah, well, we'll have to ask you to come back when you've got the Indian kind of.
Yeah, sure. I think it'll be really interesting. Well, I was really surprised by the similarities, to be honest, in the crops being grown and the kind of you know, the approaches as well.
And is there any kind of sort of overview paper that you know about that sort of looks at all of the urban agricultural sort of experiments that have been going on in the UK? Have you encountered that in your sort of background research?
That's a really good question. So we obviously, in our kind of paper in sustainability science, we tried to draw together kind of taking a global approach, but I don't know of any kind of reviews just of UK data at the moment. And actually kind of the PNAS paper that I mentioned, that came out kind of just after I think our review was published. So, so and some studies from Sheffield as well. So I think it's a rapidly developing field, and we all use very similar methods of kind of self-reporting and citizen science. And I think that's just because of the kind of barriers to trying to, you know, even in the UK, trying to access an allotment is really difficult, you know.
Really difficult, yeah.
And they're like, they're very, I mean, they have very tight security, so I had to do a lot of networking to kind of just get access. And
yes, I know. There's a kind of new kind of privatization going there because everyone pinches their crops. I know. Now, I need to, this is causing a lot of excitement, your talk in the chat. So let me just go first into the chat and then I'll go to the collaboration room where we have a couple of questions. So in the chat then from Ewan Hammett, and he's saying the big question is, how do you move from small scale research to making urban growing mainstream? And urban growing promotes not only healthy eating, but of course, as you said, physical and social activity, which will in turn reduce health and social care costs. So did you think about approaching Brighton Council to ask them if they would allocate segments of parkland for growing and whether they could facilitate this? I mean, is there any appetite from the council to scale up, or is they happy with where they are?
Yeah, so we have been approached by a few different kind of departments related to the council. So Brighton has around the campus, actually, in the edge of the city, there's a lot of farmland that is owned by the council and is currently farmed very conventionally by kind of tenant farmers. But that whole estate is undergoing a massive review at the moment. And so our kind of results are feeding into that and the potential to kind of convert some of that land into kind of agroecological small-scale farming. And there are already some amazing cooperative farming initiatives in Brighton, but they are quite reliant on kind of volunteered labour. So they tend to be community agriculture, which is fantastic, but is difficult to, I guess, to scale up to large scale. And I suppose that's one of the limitations of the small scale growing that we've been studying, is that it is so labour intensive. But you know, that also does provide kind of opportunities for work, and it's how the land can be so productive because you're using it in such kind of innovative ways and intercropping and that kind of thing. So yes, yeah, that's a really nice outcome, and we've kind of we've got good links with them, and they've helped us promote the project to the participants and things, so they're very kind of tied in. And the allotment federation as well in Brighton is very large and very active, and at protecting the existing land, to be honest, because some of those areas have also come under threat from development. But so far the allotment federation has won against that, but yeah, it's a continuing threat. So but I think it would be fantastic if that estate land could be used in a more innovative and agroecological way.
Yeah. No, I imagine that the allotment federation are quite fierce in Brighton, actually, I should think, aren't they? Yeah, good thing too. Yeah. Let's move over to the collaboration room, because we've got two questions, one from Ying to start with, and then one from Bob, and they can ask them in person, which is nice. So Ying, we're over to you in the collaboration, please.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your amazing speech. So my question is about the using of citizen scientists in your project. Mm-hmm. So I just want to ask, besides ask the local residents to collect data, are there any other reasons or aims actually to engage the local people in the research? And also another question is about the impacts. So did you see any impacts on the individual participants and also on the communities? So that's my question.
Great question, Ying. So where to start? So I'll start with the impact. So I guess the really nice thing about it being quite a small scale citizen science project kind of geographically meant that I got to know pretty much all of those 34 super engaged participants really, really well. And they tended to be the ones whose allotment sites I then visited as well. So I was doing the surveys too, so that we can eventually compare kind of citizen science collected data versus data collected by an ecologist to check that the kind of data is good enough, if that makes sense. So it's not going to be perfect because those people aren't professionally trained scientists, but it might be good enough to kind of give us an idea of the pollination dependency, for example. And so we held focus groups for those participants where we kind of fed back the data to them, but then we also asked them what they thought. And one of the really cool things that came out of that was that one of the things they noticed and actually demotivated people a bit is that when they were trying to record pollinators from their crops, they noticed that the bees were all on wildflowers and lavender and all the other lovely things that they planted in their allotments. And then they said they started to get worried that actually having all of these flowers was distracting the pollinators from their crops. They kind of posed this question to us. And so then with my PhD student at the time, we actually designed another experiment based on their question to test this. So we gave people strawberries again and asked them to grow borage, which is very attractive to pollinators. And we thankfully found that actually having the wildlife friendly flowers improved the strawberry yields. So that was a nice result. So we didn't have to tell people, oh no, you should get rid of all the flowers from your allotment. So that was one of the impacts, I suppose, is that the people became really engaged in the research to the point of kind of co-creating their own questions. But also anecdotally, a lot of people told us that it really did change their perception of insects in their allotments, and maybe, for example, their understanding that there is more than just bees that pollinate, and that there's more than just honeybees and bumblebees, that you get very tiny bees and all different life histories. We didn't really collect data on that because I guess our team was sort of lacking someone with those qualitative skills, but it's a real shame. And I think if I'd known a bit more about those kind of field diary methods, I could have probably collected some really interesting data around, you know, people's motivations for growing their own food. And many of the people who submitted a lot of the yield data, you know, that food was part of their weekly food budget, for example. They were really interested in that, you know, how much that food was worth. So that's why they got so engaged in that part of the project. And I think that would be interesting to dig more into as well. So sorry, that's a very long answer. I hope that answered your question.
No, I'm sure it did. That was really, really good. Well, next time you want to do a citizen science project, then why don't you contact us? We're kind of happy.
Yeah, that would be brilliant.
So we've got a thank you, Ying, very good question. And so now we're moving to Bob in the collaboration room. So Bob, it's over to you, please.
Thanks for the excellent presentation. And you noted that most urban agriculture is small scale plots, which is not very efficient. And I'm wondering, I used to live in a co-housing community and we had a community garden, but we had one person who was a really good farmer who sort of managed the whole thing. And then people could contribute, you know, either labor or money, and they got a certain share depending on how much they contributed. So, and the whole thing was very well run and very efficient, and I think very engaging for everyone. And I think it helped to build community around the garden, probably more than have everybody having their own individual plot. And probably could do a better job of managing the whole system sustainably and dealing with pollinators, et cetera. Is that happening here in the UK? And if not, should it be?
Yes, I guess I kind of said that as well, that I think that it does work really well at a community level because, as I say, as you do say, you can share the labour but also share the produce. And there is a community supported agriculture scheme in Brighton called Fork and Digit, where they run a veg box scheme, and yeah, you can basically contribute labour or contribute costs, and then you get just a share of whatever, you know, is harvested each month, for example. So and they do have a lot of volunteers who kind of contribute that labour, but then they obviously have very skilled people who know how to use the land and how to rotate crops or intercrop, and I think that's important. And I also think when I've spoken to the council, I think Brighton has a thing now where new developments do need to include some space for, you know, some green space, some growing space, and I think that would be really good for kind of particularly new developments in urban areas where people don't have a garden or anything, then providing kind of a community growing space and some level of organisation, you know, someone to kind of maybe manage that across different sites in the city could be really good. And so the Food Association in Brighton does do a lot of that, and they do manage community gardens. But I definitely think it can be really daunting to start your own like small holding or small plot, and you definitely need that transfer of skills from the people with the expertise. So yeah, there are some kind of buddy schemes, but yeah, I think there are increasingly more of these community supported agriculture schemes in the UK.
Yeah, great, fantastic. So let's segue back to the chat. We have, thank you, Bob. And then we've got another question now from Manali Jasani, saying there's substantial research that links use of chemicals and insecticides in farming to negative environmental and health impacts, along with, as you said in your talk, Beth, consistently reducing agricultural production, leading to barren land. So there's a lot of growing noise around regenerative agriculture. So where does your research stand on this regenerative? I mean, is it part of a regenerative agriculture initiative, or is it more just narrowly focused on pollinators?
I mean, I personally am very interested in regenerative agriculture, and my work outside of the urban agriculture has been around sampling conventional farming environments for neonicotinoid pesticides, and then measuring impacts on bee behavior and physiology, and you know, the results are you know, we have the evidence that it is negatively impacting on bee populations. There's not much data on other insects, but the levels of contamination were really shocking, and not just in the crop, but in wildflowers and hedgerows and things. And it's just not sustainable, you know. Eventually the pests will get resistance to those chemicals, and the new chemicals will come out, and, you know, we'll have to do more testing to show that it is having negative environmental impacts. So I agree that kind of relying on purely chemical control of pests is not sustainable. And yeah, I would agree with kind of a balanced approach and using agroecological principles.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Let's go to Chris Harker, who's saying, why is species diversity so important for pollination?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess I didn't elaborate on that. So essentially, bees and insects, they all come in very different sizes and different levels of hairiness, and have kind of different behavioural traits. And flowers come in different shapes and sizes as well. And so depending on the kind of compatibility, depends on how well a particular insect pollinates a particular flower or crop flower. And so tomatoes are a really good example. So their anthers, so the bit that produces pollen, is enclosed, and it has to be vibrated at a specific frequency to release the pollen and to lead to pollination. And honeybees can't do this vibration, only bumblebees and certain other tropical bees can do that. So honeybees, for example, just simply cannot kind of pollinate. So the more diversity you have, more likelihood you have of having the optimal forager, optimal pollinator for a particular crop in that environment.
Yeah, but interesting that it's, as you said, flies that pollinate coffee and chocolate. Is that right? Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah,
We will all have to change our view about flies rather rapidly, I can see. So Mara Muldoon is saying, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And what can urban dwellers do to support pollinator populations?
Oh, great question. So my PhD student actually just is about to publish a really nice paper showing that, you know, even a tiny amount of kind of 1 meter, 2 meter square area of wildflowers can massively improve kind of pollinator diversity in your garden or in your allotments. So she ran a study looking, again, a citizen science study looking at the effectiveness of these kind of mini meadows. So planting more flowers that bees like, but also consider kind of providing habitat for nesting bees as well. So bee hotels, for example, and just generally being a bit messier and not tidying up and letting the grass and grow a bit longer, and providing kind of refuge for wildlife as well. But if everybody kind of could grow a few bee-friendly flowers in their gardens, the area that gardens cover across the UK is massive. So kind of added up, it becomes a really huge resource for pollinators.
Great. And then we've got a question, excuse me, slightly more technical, about, did you record the number of fruit or vegetables that were produced per plant and the number of plants that produced versus the number that failed to produce, to relate this to pollination visits? So was a...
Yeah, that's so we didn't do that. We just asked people to record which insects they saw on their flowering crops. So it's not a perfect method, because just because an insect's visiting a flower doesn't necessarily mean it's pollinating, but it gives us some indication. I did have a student that summer look at we call it single visit pollination efficiency. So essentially bagging flowers, not letting anything visit the flower, then unbagging and letting one particular type of insect visit, and then seeing how well the fruit develops. It was a really, really hot summer, and he didn't have a great time doing it, to be honest. So we don't have great data on that, but that is something that we'd like to look at more for urban crops, and particularly in India. A lot of the crops grown there, it's not really known what exactly which insects or you know, animals are pollinating. So there's definitely scope to do more of that in the urban farms in India as well.
Mm. And then a question from Justin Van Wyk, who's saying complementary planting affects the volume and diversity of species. So did you take this into consideration? And if not, would you think that future studies could incorporate the effects of complementary planting in attracting insect species and ultimately in how that might affect production yields?
Yeah, that's a great question and something we're really interested in. So the complementary planting is the idea of planting something, you know, like borage, as I said, that's really insect attractive next to a crop, and then it kind of serves as an advertisement and draws the pollinators in. And people have shown that for polytunnels, for example, if you plant wildflowers around the entrances to polytunnels, you get good enough pollination that you wouldn't need to kind of supplement that with brought in bumblebee colonies, for example. And so that's kind of what that project that I said that the citizen scientists developed themselves, asking about the distraction, was testing. And yes, it showed that if you have this very bee attractive plant next to your strawberries, you're getting better strawberry yields. And we'd really like to look at that more, because obviously there's also people do complementary planting for pest control as well. So planting marigolds to encourage hoverflies, which then predate on things like aphids. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting area of research that doesn't have much scientific backing, but certainly urban growers and allotment growers do it a lot. So it would be nice to test how well it works.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got a couple of questions, I think, coming up in the chat. One from Nick Grayson, or not quite sure whether it's Nick or somebody else, because there's two names there, but it might be Alessandro. So Nick or Alessandro, apologies. Talking about whether you know about this work from Martin Berg in Gothenburg on circular economies and so on. So I think that might be something we should follow up later, but it's connected to the Saturn project, which you might know about. Yeah,
it sounds really interesting. I'll have a look at that comment later maybe, and we can have a chat about it.
Yeah,
thank you.
And then we've got one from Trina Mosley saying, I'm interested to know what you feel are the biggest barriers to extending and expanding projects like this. And the project's brilliant, but Brighton tends to have something of a kind of liberal environmental bias, because of course it has a Green MP and a number of other things. Yeah. So how do we get more engagement, do you think, in food sort of projects like this? And what are the challenges, especially for people who are time poor?
I mean, the demand is there across the UK at least. So there's some, I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but particularly during COVID lockdowns, interest in allotment spaces went kind of through the roof, and people, you know, selling out garden centres of plants and soil and you know, raised beds and that kind of thing. So I think there's a massive interest in getting involved. It's just access to land is the biggest barrier, I would say. So
yeah,
you know, in Brighton, I think there's about 1,000 people on the waiting list, and as you say, it's a very green and liberal city, but we have quite a lot of growing space as well, and I imagine there are similar waiting lists in other cities. So I think the interest is there. It's just getting people access to the land, and maybe also the confidence to grow. There's a lot of trial and error involved, and it can be pretty disheartening. So having something like a community agricultural scheme or a buddy scheme, something organised, I think is good. But it's, I guess, convincing, and that's what I kind of hope our data will go some way towards, as well as the other data that I presented from other groups, in convincing councils and planners of the kind of value of using this land to produce food, that it is improving kind of health and nutritional outcomes for people, and also kind of a win-win for biodiversity as well.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with the sort of whole systems approach to change. In other words, you know, a broader understanding of how this fits into transformational change for the livability of cities in a sustainable way, I think is really well. Now we have got more questions, but I'm very mindful of time, so I'm going to ask the last one. Is a fun question, and it's also from Mara Muldoon, and she's saying, what's your favorite fun fact about bee behavior?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, my brain is so full of bee facts. I mean, I guess my favourite question I've ever been asked by, I give a lot of talks to kind of primary schools and things, and one of the children, I was telling them all about all the different jobs that bees do in a hive, and there's a lot. And then one of the children asked me, "Oh, do they ever get a day off?" And I thought such a good question, and I was like, "Oh, I've never really thought about that." But you know, bees do sleep, and they do take it in turns in the hive to take a break. And some researchers have even shown that when bees sleep, they're kind of consolidating memories. So if they're trained in a learning task and then they're allowed to rest, the next day they'll perform better. So some researchers have said that that could be equivalent to kind of bees dreaming. It depends how far you want to take that kind of interpretation of memory consolidation. But that's definitely one of my favorite kind of facts about them all sort of taking it in turns to perform.
It sounds like it should be a really good sort of, science fiction novel or something, shouldn't it? Dreams of Bees, maybe that's on your next list.
Yeah, next one.
So, Beth, thank you so much for what's been a fantastic conversation. Everyone's really enjoyed it, and for joining us at the IGP. And we hope that we'll see you soon again with us and carry on our conversation. And so I think I and the collaboration room could just give you a round of applause. Thank you very much. We'll see you very soon. Yeah, have a great day. All right. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.